Lewis Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to indicate that as a party, Labor would like a personal vote, please. So my contribution to the sale and supply of alcohol extended licensing hours during Rugby World Cup bill is going to be in two halves, actually. But before I do that, I'd just like to congratulate David Seymour. Putting a bill before this House is a really important and big opportunity, and obviously you've put this bill forward because you think that there is a need, and so I commend you for that. The game of two halves that I'm going to play in my speech, Mr. Speaker, actually firstly has to be an acknowledgement that within my electorate of Manurewa, I had two groups submit. The first was the Manurewa Business Association. So to Wendy Dunn and the businesses in Manurewa, I acknowledge that you don't support this piece of legislation. I acknowledge that from your perspective that this bill is not necessary, that it denies natural justice because it was put through so quickly, and that for you, alcohol-related harm, which is a big issue in our community, will not be minimised through this bill, and in fact you think it's going to add or exacerbate the harm in our community. I would also like to acknowledge Angela Dalton and the Manurewa Local Board, who too do not support this piece of legislation. For them, there is no evidence that it will fulfil the objectives of the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act, and that for them it is poor lawmaking. They also highlighted, and I'd like to highlight, that the process to enable the over 8,000 New Zealand businesses who actually have Sky subscriptions. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the over 8,000 businesses in New Zealand who have Sky subscriptions, who would then be in a position to be able to invite the public into their premises to watch rugby. That from our local board perspective, it was going to have too big an impact on both the police, who of course do great service in our communities to minimise the harm associated with alcohol, but also they were quite clear that from an Auckland Council perspective, and we've already heard from my colleague Kevin Haig, that Auckland Council were one of the submitters who opposed this piece of legislation. The other submission that I want to highlight is from the Public Health Association, which said actually let them open, but don't let them sell alcohol. And in fact, if you're a club, you could have opened and not sold alcohol. So actually there were alternatives to being able to provide off this business Sky platform so that the public could have seen the matches. I'd also like to acknowledge actually that in December last year, a group that was chaired by Graham Lowe, and we all know Lowe, who's one of our sporting legends in the league area, that Lowe, who was chaired this commission, or this group that was put together by the then Minister of Justice, Judith Collins, in 2012, what they did was recommend to the government that alcohol sponsorship of sports clubs needed to cease, and that we should be looking at banning advertising of alcohol during licensed matches. Now, it's really relevant for us to talk about these recommendations because it was also a recommendation of the Law Commission that undertook a two-year process of reviewing the impact of alcohol in our lives. And so this is actually a convergence, this piece of legislation from my perspective. It's a convergence of alcohol and how alcohol seems to have this relationship to New Zealanders and our culture, and also rugby, and how rugby has a relationship and impacts on our culture. Because I've also found, Mr. Chair, a 2011 Masters titled Impact of Alcohol on the Rugby Team Culture. It was written by Philip Scott Kahu Koika, and basically what it does is it traces why alcohol is so prevalent within the rugby community. And I've got to say, when I played rugby both for Waitemata, for suburbs, for college rifles, at the end of the game, you'd go into the shed and there'd be a crate of beer. or a box of beer, and you would consume that box of beer while you were having a shower, and then you'd go into the club rooms and you'd consume a few more beers. And if you were the player of the day, and sometimes I was, you got a bottle of wine. And so there's this intimate relationship, Mr. Speaker, between alcohol, rugby, team building, which is one of the things that this Masters student highlights, is that somehow it's all become morphed into one big thing. And I see this piece of legislation actually as highlighting that. But I think there's a great opportunity for us as a country to take stock, to acknowledge that actually for us and the public to see the Rugby World Cup, we have to amend the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act. Isn't that interesting? And so I think there's a big opportunity for us to think about what are the consequences of this piece of legislation going through today, because I actually will vote in favour of this bill, and I will do after consulting with my Manurewa Rugby Club, who wanted to get a special licence. And they had a very interesting conversation with the council, and they were told that for them to obtain a special licence, Mr. Chair, that actually it was most likely going to be vetoed by the council. And so, in fact, it was going to be very difficult for some rugby clubs, some people who have these, business Sky licences, to be able to show the rugby. So, in fact, I do think David Seymour is fixing a problem in some areas. But what I want to also do with my contribution to this bill is actually highlight bigger issues about the relationship between rugby and alcohol, sport and alcohol, the harm in our community, what groups like Graham Lowe's has done, the recommendations that they've given to the government, and actually challenge us past the Rugby World Cup, which actually is running from the 19th of September to the 1st of November. So we're using the resources of this Parliament for a very specific piece of legislation. But I think the opportunity for us to really consider the whole relationship between alcohol, sport, and what we do in the future, particularly in communities like mine, where there is obvious issues about how people are consuming alcohol, what the police position is. I mean, one of the things that I have unanswered in this process is that within 7 days of a game, you have to notify the District Licensing Committee and also the police. So you notify the police, and then what do the police do with this information? Are they getting more resources? Are they going to be able to monitor the sites that are going to show the rugby to the public? Are we going to say to the police, it would be great if you had a presence at these particular venues? I mean, and that's the missing thing in this legislation for me. But I guess, thank you, Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity through this process to say to the Minister of Police that we would expect that the police would have an ongoing role. It wouldn't just be about notifying them that the Manurewa Rugby Club was going to watch, and they're only intending on covering the quarterfinals, the semi-finals and the finals, even though the scope of this bill allows them to be open for all the games. For them, it's actually about rugby. And so for me, it's actually about rugby, and that's why I'm voting in support of this legislation. But if I voted from my other hat, which is that actually this is about the harm that alcohol is causing in our communities, and if for me the overriding factor in this legislation was alcohol, then I would vote against it. But I guess because I am biased, I'm one of those New Zealanders who is passionate, and I have represented our country in rugby, and I'm very proud of that. And I'm proud of the All Blacks, and I'm proud of what they contribute and represent to us and on an international stage. So I do think that rugby is special. And that's why this piece of legislation is special, and why we're debating it under urgency, well, not under urgency, but in a very, expedited process, because we wouldn't make allowances for just anything. But what I do hope is that there will be ongoing conversations about actually how we can look at what the relationship between sport, rugby, alcohol is, and how we can use this opportunity to make some positive change in the future. Kia ora.
The next call is a split call.